Welcome back, everybody. With this video, we're going to continue our story on the origins, the history of the American labor movement, labor during the Gilded Age, if you will. In the last video, uh, we talked about its origins, and it concluded with the Haymarket Affair. And, and we kind of ended on the note of, what that, the publicity and how it affected public opinion and what it would mean for the most powerful labor federation in the country at the time, the Knights of Labor, and for unionism and the labor movement in general. They could not shrug the reputation of being violent or being infiltrated by political radicals, and that, of course, cost them a lot of members that didn't want to be associated with that sort of thing. And the next couple of years are going to be pretty difficult for unionism in general. And so maybe you should ask, well, how did it survive? How did it survive those difficult years, particularly after Haymarket? And the answer is very cautiously, very cautiously. And this brings us to Scottish immigrant, cigar worker himself, and labor activist, labor leader Samuel Gompers, who in 1881 founded a labor federation to rival the Knights of Labor because there were differences. Whereas the Knights of Labor wanted to eventually unite all the laboring classes under one union, the Knights of Labor, Samuel Gompers preferred craft unionism, saw that as the most practical way, the least threatening way, the least ideological way of keeping unionism alive. So founded in 1881 as the Federation of Organized Trades and Labor Unions, they changed their name in 1886 to the American Federation of Labor, which still exists today. Therefore, it is technically the oldest and still in existence labor federation in the country. Like I mentioned earlier, the AFL rejected the Knights of Labor's social and political activism. The AFL was created in opposition to efforts from the Knights of Labor to centralize the leadership of all the craft unions under Terence Powderly. Gompers preferred a loose federation of mostly independent traditional craft unions instead. And of course, helped by the bad publicity that the Knights of Labor received as they were associated with the events at Haymarket, this in effect is going to end up assisting and benefiting the American Federation of Labor, which had a tough couple of first years, but would actually benefit from the demise of the Knights of Labor. The American Federation of Labor adopted a more conservative approach, concentrating solely on bread and butter issues, the wages and working conditions of its membership, rather than challenging property rights or capitalism itself. Gompers had no great goal of uniting the entire working class. If anything, the AFL's leadership believed that the expansion of capitalism was key to improving the situation of labor. It's kind of, you wouldn't expect that from a labor guy, but Gompers did believe that if capital does well, eventually labor will do well as well, which was different. Um, the AFL believed they rejected at first they rejected the membership of women, African Americans, and unskilled workers, believing that it would make it more difficult for them to negotiate for high wages. They also opposed unrestricted immigration. Eventually, they would come around and reverse their positions. But that is one thing that they also differed from the Knights of Labor, and were on the wrong side of history. Yet, despite the AFL's cautious, non-partisan, non-political approach to unionism, they still ended up involved in organizing strikes and boycotts, and in fact, were not afraid to involve themselves in strikes and boycotts, like the next one we're going to talk about now. Well, not yet. Here I included this slide here. So you get the idea of the structure and the purpose of the AFL. AFL exists as an umbrella organization, a labor federation that represents dozens of craft trade unions and their locals at a national level. Okay, so as you can see from the different union seals there, machinists, postal workers, painters, carpenters, electricians, you name it, and their parent organization, if you will, at the national level, is the AFL, the American Federation of Labor. So, like I promised, back to AFL not being shy from involving itself in strikes, and in 1892, that's where we're going to find ourselves. Just 5 years after Haymarket and the collapse of the Knights of Labor, the AFL emerges as the new labor federation in town with a new way of doing it. Homestead, Pennsylvania, just across the river from Pittsburgh, Steel City. The Homestead Steel Plant, the only steel plant in the Carnegie Steel Empire to actually have a union, to have one union recognition, which was not easy. Carnegie was anti-union. He wanted nothing to do with unions. He would get rid of, if he even smelt that somebody was even thinking about forming a union in any of his plants, but they snuck past him in Homestead, and Homestead was the only one that actually had one. Hugh O'Donnell led the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers at Homestead, which was an AFL affiliated trade union. With their 3-year contract about to expire, the Carnegie Company refused to negotiate a new one. Despite record profits, the company announced wage cuts and longer hours. Needless to say, this is a confrontation in the making. And this is what's going to lead to another infamous moment in the labor history of this country, the Homestead Strike of 1892. Conscious of bad publicity, and pretty much having a good idea of what's going to go down, Carnegie placed his CEO, Henry Frick, another anti-union guy, in charge of the Homestead plant and the effort to break the union, while Carnegie went off to Europe to create some distance between himself and what's going to happen. On July 1st, the union, feeling they had no other option, they call for a strike. What does Frick do? He begins construction of a 3-mile long perimeter fence all around the plant, with barbed wire and even observation towers. With this fence, Frick hopes to lock the strikers out of the factory, who set up camp along the dock and the riverside, and eventually bring in replacements. Six days later, with the strikers holding their ground outside the fence along the riverside and the dock, Frick puts his plan into action. He actually hires 2 barges full of Pinkerton agents. And if you read that note, that's a note that a telegram that Frick sent to Carnegie, and it makes no secret that he plans to employ violence to get his way. And Carnegie signs off on it, so Carnegie's okay with it. Hoping to bring in replacement workers, but worried about the striker retaliation, because of course men on strike don't particularly care for scabs. Frick hires 2 barges of Pinkertons to force their way past the strikers and open a path for the replacements. As the barges approach, gunfire was exchanged. But in an ingenious move, using 4th of July fireworks, that which they had left from 2 days ago, because 2 days earlier was the 4th of July. The strikers fired on the barges, setting one ablaze and forcing it to retreat, and forcing the other one to surrender to the strikers, who took the Pinkertons into custody, marched them into town, through town, to the train station, and out. So, for all intents and purposes, the strikers won what was called the Battle of Homestead. They smashed through the fence, occupied the plant, expecting more Pinkertons to come. But it wasn't going to be more Pinkertons. 6 days after the Battle of Homestead, with the workers dug in behind the fence, which they repaired, the way they got in. 10 days into the standoff, actually, public opinion was divided. Half of the public sided with Carnegie, the other half with the strikers. Carnegie demanded that Pennsylvania Governor Patterson break the lockout. And under pressure, he sent 12,000 state militia. The strike leaders, they treated the Pinkertons civilly, and they wanted it known that their enemy was not the Pinkertons or the soldiers. It was Frick and company policy. And despite their attempts to actually peacefully welcome the state militia, it fell on deaf ears. The commander made it clear that he sided with the company. The plant was taken within 20 minutes of the militia's arrival. The commander places the town under martial law. The strike leaders are arrested and brought on charges, and the replacements were brought in. And what do we learn from this? They lost. This was another loss for labor. Um, of note, unlike the railroad strikes that occurred the previous decade, this one was actually led. This one was actually had a leader and was planned and was organized. Not quite done yet, though. 2 weeks later, a lone gunman that had nothing to do with the Union or the Homestead Strike happened to be the lover of anarchist Emma Goldman. We'll talk about her in the future. Found his way to Homestead to the office of Frick and attempted to assassinate Frick and failed. Because of this action, the public turned against the unions and ended up being sympathetic towards the company. And of course, uh, despite Gompers, and the AFL failed to intervene, actually. And so that was another bit of bad news. But more is on the way. Just 6 months after the Homestead Strike, the country is going to experience yet another economic crisis and downturn. The Panic of 1893, which actually is going to last till 1897. And I don't want to get too much into detail because I'm going to save this topic for a future presentation. It was caused by the collapse of two very substantially large companies, the Pennsylvania and Reading Railroad and the National Cordage Company. Fearing that another economic downturn was around the corner, people panicked, went to the bank, withdrew their money, left the banks without any money, redeemed their dollars for actual gold and silver. And this is going to make a lot of sense when I talk to you about the gold standard and the silver standard. Leaving the government without any gold or silver in its reserves. Therefore, the government could not print and circulate new money. Banks, unable to borrow from the government, held on to what cash assets, whatever cash they still had, and definitely were less than willing to lend any money out. And this uh, is going to create a very troublesome economic crisis. In comes Grover Cleveland for his second term, in fact. Grover Cleveland, a conservative Bourbon Democrat, means, favored by the moneyed classes, and a general overall, for the most part, horrible human being. We'll talk about that sometime later. Um, within days, he begins his second term, within days of the panic beginning. Hoping to stop our reserves from hemorrhaging silver, he gets Congress to repeal the 1890 Sherman Silver Purchase Act. Therefore, the government will not be circulating new silver notes, and actually, this makes the situation even worse. We call this a credit crunch. The government's not lending to banks, the banks are not lending to people. What happens? Businesses that require credit to run can no longer run, they close, investments don't happen, et cetera, et cetera. And before you know it, we are spiraling into a recession. And it's exactly under this scenario that I want to introduce you to the next tycoon. Meet George Pullman, resident of Chicago. George Pullman made his money in railroads, but not by owning track, but by designing railroad cars, specifically passenger railroad cars, specifically luxury passenger rail cars. State of the art. Better springs, better suspension, more wheels than the typical train car for a smoother ride, luxurious furnishings and upholstery and decorations on the inside. This is for the upper middle class and wealthy to feel that they were traveling in style, that this wasn't a Pullman sleeper car, palace car, was an extension of home. He actually got his start. He was the one that provided the car that transported Lincoln's body after his assassination, and before you know it, he's getting orders left and right for these passenger cars, and he himself amasses a fortune in the millions. Which brings us to Chicago, his hometown. Pullman, part of the rich and wealthy of Chicago, absolutely, but kind of sees himself as a reformer, kind of progressive minded. Uh, he knows that the majority of the working poor lives in squalor and filth and poverty and crime and all that. And he wants to try something different. He wants to create a community that is carefully managed and is free of crime and poverty and filth. And he does so south of Chicago. It was a different town then. Not today. It's actually just a suburb, a neighborhood of Chicago. You see the map there. It's to the south of Chicago itself. And on this land that he buys to set up not just the center of his manufacturing efforts, but this is where he's going to house his employees. And, well, he founds the town of, well, of course he's going to name it Pullman. I mean, Pullman cars, Pullman, Illinois. George Pullman is a man that is very impressed with himself. So he is going to pretty much name everything after himself, or as many things as he get away with. Um, another example, because this is also historically significant of his, how he saw himself as this progressive reformer. Unlike, other employers, particularly the rail lines, he made it a point to exclusively hire only black men to be porters on his trains. I mean, basically that means assisting the passengers with luggage and their request on the trains. Uh, to the point that white passengers, which were the only people that could ride these train cars, would refer to these porters as George. No matter what their name was, they were called George, kind of paternalistic, you know, making a statement as if they're George Foreman's children. I mean, not George Pullman's children. And he didn't pay them any wages, though. They were supposed to live on tips alone. So that was just one example. But about this town, Pullman, it gets kind of crazy. Yes, the factory's there that manufactures the Pullman cars, but he also owns the housing and the church and the stores in town. And it even gets to the point that he doesn't actually pay his employees in actual United States dollars. He pays them in company script, meaning Pullman dollars, which are absolutely worthless outside of Pullman, but you could pay for stuff in Pullman's stores and you could pay the rent in Pullman housing. So the guy has a complete circular loop, 100% control over his highly managed town. He thought he was doing good, but he did not recognize, just how repressive of a community that he created. And then, like Carnegie, he was anti-union. Pullman was his baby. He didn't need a union to come in and interfere with what he was going to do. Now, we talked about, the panic of 93, and companies are going to start, hurting all over. Pullman is no exception. So he announces, in order to, salvage profits, and here's the other thing, he paid well, but rents were high and prices were high in its stores. So, one hand took away from the other. And his need to salvage profits after the economic downturn, he decided to cut wages by 25%, but kept rents and prices as they were. And needless to say, the employees at Pullman um, were at their wits' end because it's not like you could go live somewhere else. It wasn't practical. You had to live, in that town uh, if you worked in his company. And if he fired you, guess what you were also, dealing with? You no longer had a house. And the money that you did save up is worthless outside of Pullman. So that's just a number of unethical things. Well, the workers had had enough. They just couldn't deal with this wage cut because they just couldn't afford it. They weren't supported by a union, they weren't represented by a union, and they decided to go on strike anyway. And here we are, uh, just 2 years after Homestead. Now in Illinois, the Pullman Strike of 1894. So on May 11th, 4,000 unorganized and unrepresented Pullman workers walked off the job. They went on strike. All they wanted was to get George Pullman to recognize a union at Pullman and negotiate with their union, and Pullman refused. Eventually, news got around and they caught the attention of the American Railway Union. The American Railway Union, in just a couple of years, had emerged to represent a variety of railway workers under one organization. So, what the American Railway Union did was unite the switchmen and the conductors and the firemen into one union, and it had done spectacularly well in a short period of years under the leadership of Eugene Debs, who actually, started as a railman himself. He was a fireman before getting involved in the labor aspect of this. And Eugene Debs and the ARU decide to take up the cause of the folks at Pullman. And they organized a nationwide strike in solidarity. That's an important word for unionists, for people in the labor union. Solidarity with your fellow union members, whether you're in the same exact union or not. So he organized a nationwide solidarity strike with Pullman. Workers that worked on the rail were uninvolved, but the rail car handlers were the key to this because they refused to handle any Pullman cars until George Pullman recognized the union at his plant. You would think, all this takes is just, recognize a union, you'll be done with it. But George Pullman was stubborn, and so was Eugene Debs. Starting in June, it's going to last all the way to September. Under Debs' leadership, the strike grew to 250,000 strikers and shut down rail traffic throughout the Northeast and Midwest. Look at that image. Look at that illustration. When a cartoonist draws that, he's making a very real statement about the position and importance of Eugene Debs as he led the ARU in support of this strike, in support of the workers at Pullman. And then President Cleveland gets involved, and of course, he sympathizes with Pullman and orders his attorney general to obtain an injunction in federal court. An injunction is basically a court order to stop a strike until it could be mediated by a third party. The ARU ignores this injunction and responds by calling for a general strike in the city of Chicago, which Gompers opposes. Things at this point got violent. The strikers began looting and burning boxcars and coal cars. Public opinion starts to turn against the strike. President Cleveland, under pressure to do something now that things have made a turn for the worse, sends federal marshals and 12,000 soldiers in violation of the Posse Comitatus Act, city to city, putting down the strike forcefully until the strike comes to an end. And he does this despite the wishes of Illinois Governor Arjold. Public opinion now is mostly in support of Cleveland's actions, but a significant number of Southern and Western Democrats and populists, which I'll talk about later, actually condemned them. During the course of the strike, 30 strikers were killed, 57 were wounded. Property damage exceeded $80 million in 1894 dollars. Debs and the ARU leadership were arrested and charged under the Interstate Commerce Act for obstructing the U.S. mail and violating a court order. The federal charges were dropped. He was charged for violating the injunction, and Debs served 6 months in jail. Don't worry, folks. This is not the end of Eugene Debs. It's actually the beginning. We're not done yet with the ramifications of the Pullman strike. Ironically, the Cleveland administration opened an investigation into the strike and found George Pullman partly to blame and his company as un-American. Finding the Pullman city charter in violation of state law, the state of Illinois actually forced Pullman uh, to sell all of his housing real estate. I kind of jumped to the next slide too soon. To sell off all the housing because the way he was running the city was in violation of state law. And then Cleveland, being the politician that he was, worried about whether he was losing the support of the populist wing of the Democratic Party, decides to throw labor a bone and declares the first Monday in September as Labor Day. And this is deliberate because by declaring the first Monday in September as Labor Day, he deliberately distances Labor Day from its more radical origins, more ideological political origins, from the fact that the rest of the world celebrates Labor Day on May 1st. So almost to isolate the American worker and by extension, American Labor Day from Labor Day in the rest of the world. Now, following his release, Debs was radicalized in jail. He became a committed advocate for socialists. Now, let's be clear here. He was not a Marxist, and there is no evidence to demonstrate that he ever read Marx. but he was a socialist of a more homegrown Christian tradition, believe it or not. We'll talk about that later. There's various schools of socialist thought. And he was a democratic socialist if you were to put a label on him today. In fact, he was the country's leading socialist voice in this country for the next several decades. He founded the Socialist Party of America. He would run for president 5 times, winning 6% of the popular vote in the 1912 election. And here's a quote, one of many Debs's quotes. I'm opposing a social order in which it is possible for one man who does absolutely nothing that is useful to amass a fortune of hundreds of millions of dollars, while millions of men and women who work all the days of their lives secure barely enough for a wretched existence. Here's a map of which we haven't talked about all of them yet. The story is not quite done. But yes, we talked about Haymarket and Homestead and Pullman. And with that, we're going to conclude this presentation. Next time, we talk about the American farmer during the Gilded Age and the founding of the populist movement.